Let's take our Bibles this morning and turn to Matthew chapter 5. We'll be in Matthew 5, beginning in verse 31 this morning. We have been looking at this chapter for a few weeks now, and we have been studying this sermon, which is the greatest sermon because it was preached by the greatest man who ever lived, Jesus Christ. Many of us know it by its title, the Sermon on the Mount, but we're calling this series, we're calling it God's Upside Down Kingdom, because that's the theme of his sermon. It's all about the kingdom of God and how it is different from the earthly kingdoms. It is unique, it is separate, and it is, in comparison, upside down. So the last few weeks we've been looking at this idea of upside down values. In God's kingdom, there are upside down values, values that aren't held by people in this world, at least by the culture as a whole. There are some who hold these values, but not all. And so we have looked at these upside down values. We started in verse 21 of chapter 5, where Jesus talks about the value of life, human life. God values it, and he doesn't want us to murder each other, but he also doesn't want us to hate each other and to be angry with each other and have unrighteous anger in our hearts, as you see in verse 22. God values human life and human relationships, and he wants us to get along with each other, to be united, and to reconcile. And as you know, as you live in this world, that's not a value that most people in our world hold. We don't, as a whole in our culture, value life. And then last week we looked at another value, upside down value, and that is the value of sexual purity. And in our society, that is upside down because we live in a very sexualized culture. But in God's eyes, sexual purity is holy and is a good thing. He says, don't commit adultery in verse 27, but also don't have adulterous thoughts in your heart. We saw that last week in verse 28. And this week, we're going to see another upside down value, which is the value of marriage. In God's kingdom, marriage is highly valued because God invented it. It was his idea. And so we're going to look at that this week here in Matthew chapter 5, beginning in verse 31. So let's look at these verses and let's see what they have to say about marriage. He says in Matthew 5:31, "Furthermore, it has been said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that whoever divorces his wife for any reason except sexual immorality causes her to commit adultery. And whoever marries a woman who is divorced commits adultery." Now we're going to look at these two verses this morning and see what Jesus has to say about marriage. But before we do, I just want to say I understand that this subject, that at least several subjects that these verses cover, are very personal and are very sensitive to many people in this room. I don't think anyone in this room hasn't been impacted by divorce in some way, shape, or form. Maybe it might be a distant relative that you have, that you know, that went through a divorce, or it might be even closer to home. Maybe even your parents went through a divorce. Maybe it's even more personal than that, and you yourself have experienced a divorce. I just want you to know I understand that. It is a sensitive subject, and I'm not going over these verses to hit anyone upside the head or to hurt anyone. I, as your pastor, love you. I care about you. But again, we have been going through this Sermon on the Mount for a few weeks now. We're going to continue through it. And these are the next verses here in the section. So we do need to see, what does Jesus have to say about this? So what does Jesus have to say about this? First of all, in verse 31, what we see is Jesus, he talks about marriage being under attack. You see that in verse 31. Marriage under attack. It says, "Furthermore, it has been said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce." So in the subject of marriage, Jesus brings up a common thing that people in Jesus' day would have said. If divorce is discussed, if it's brought up, they would quote this phrase: "Whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce." Now, that was a common phrase that people would mention back then or bring up back then when they were talking about this subject. And I want you to know that that is a very terrible summary of a Bible verse found in Deuteronomy chapter 24. So we're going to look at that context, but I want you to know right out of the gate that these people were butchering God's word. And they pick and chose a couple of words here and there, and they left some things out and mashed it together to create their theory on marriage and divorce. When I was in college, we would write papers. We'd have to write papers. And when they were talking about writing papers, they would say, make sure you don't butcher a quote. Don't just put a bunch of ellipses in, the dots, and pick and choose a couple things and take things out, and then you can create your own little quote that you want to that might support your view. But that's not good writing. That's not good research. People in the media do that constantly. You'll see that. They might splice an audio clip together or a video clip together to make someone look bad or to make someone look good. And that's basically what's going on here. So let's look at that context. Let's go back to the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 24, and let's see where this idea that they got came from. As you know, Jesus was he was ministering to a Jewish population, and they were raised on the Mosaic law, and so they based their beliefs and their practices on the Mosaic law, but sometimes they got things wrong. Sometimes they took things out of context. Sometimes they skipped over some things. And again, Jesus is combating the scribes and Pharisees, the religious teachers of his day, and saying, you guys might say this, but I say this. So let's look at Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 1, where it says, when a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some uncleanness in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce, puts it in her hand, and sends her out of his house, when she has departed from his house and goes and becomes another man's wife, if the latter husband detests her and writes her a certificate of divorce, puts it in her hand, and sends her out of his house, or if the latter husband dies who took her as his wife, then her former husband who divorced her must not take her back to be his wife after she has been defiled. For that is an abomination before the Lord, and you shall not bring your sin on the land which the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance. So again, they are taking these 4 verses and mashing them up into one idea and neglecting to mention several things. First of all, this is a very specific situation. Notice all the ifs that are found in these verses. This is a conditional law. This is a specific situation with a lot of ifs. And then notice also that in verse 20 or verse 1 of Deuteronomy chapter 24, God wasn't saying that they were divorcing for any reason. He was saying they were divorcing over some uncleanness. So what we're talking about here is not just any kind of, grudge or any kind of problem that a husband might have with his wife. It was a very specific thing. We're talking about uncleanness, and the Hebrew word is debated about what does it mean, what kind of uncleanness. But most commentators that I read talked about some kind of sexual impropriety is going on here. In that situation, if the husband divorces his wife and she goes, marries another man, and he dies or he gets divorced, then she can't go back to her original husband. Okay, so it's a very specific situation. Now let's go back to Matthew chapter 5. Jesus talks about how people in his day were alluding to this and saying, go ahead and get divorced. Now, there is an interesting historical document in Jewish culture called the Mishnah. And you can look it up if you want to. It's very interesting because it gives us a picture of the Jewish culture in Jesus' day, a little bit before, during his day, and after. And there were two schools of thought concerning divorce in Jesus' day, according to this document called the Mishnah. The one school of thought was from the school of Shammai. He was a rabbi. And Shammai said, a man may not divorce his wife unless he has found unchastity in her. And that theory or that view came from Deuteronomy chapter 24, and understanding that it says, because the husband finds some kind of uncleanness in her. You'll see that in the Mishnah. They actually quote it. But then there was another school of thought from the school of Hillel. And Hillel was a rabbi who lived around the time of Jesus. And he said, a man may divorce his wife even if she burned or oversalted his dish. It's literally in the Mishnah. It says it that way. She burns his dish, she oversalts it, and he doesn't like it. She's out. And they take that from Deuteronomy chapter 24, where it said, how did it phrase it? It happens that she finds no favor in his eyes. And they put a little period there. Oh, he doesn't like her. He's no longer a fan. Now he can divorce her. And then they would both say, whether it was the school of Shammai or the school of Hillel, that at the very least, the husband needs to write her a certificate of divorce. How nice. So that was their idea. That was their theory. And it seems, according to what Jesus is saying here in chapter 5, verse 31 of Matthew, that the majority of people in Jesus' day were siding with the school of Hillel. It didn't matter what the excuse was, what the issue was. A husband really could divorce his wife for any reason that he came up with. As long as he gave her a certificate of divorce, it was lawful. It was acceptable in God's eyes. Now, I want you to see how this is an attack on marriage. This is an attack on marriage because they were saying, really, for any reason, you can just get a divorce. I think it was 100 years after Jesus' life, there was another rabbi. His name was Rabbi Akiva, and this is also in the Mishnah, and he said this, if a man finds a more beautiful woman, he may divorce his wife. And so marriage was under attack in Jesus' day, but I want you to think about who was attacking marriage. It wasn't just the Roman culture or the Roman Empire. It was people who claimed to follow God. People claimed to follow His Word. People who literally took chapter and verse and made it say what they thought they wanted it to say. And unfortunately, it was an attack on the institution of marriage. Now, the same thing is true today. I mean, we can look at marriage and we can look at the world and our culture and say, okay, gay marriage has been legalized. That's an attack on marriage. We can look at divorce statistics in the culture. 40% of marriages in the U.S. end in divorce. We can look at polyamory that's becoming popular in our culture and all kinds of other behaviors. We can even look at the Marxists who say their stated goal is the destruction of the nuclear family. But really, I think the most concerning problem is that in the church, amongst Christians, marriage is under attack too. In fact, one of the statistics that I looked at said that the divorce rate among Christians, among churchgoers, is not that much different from that amongst just the average culture. 35% of Christian marriages end in divorce. So Jesus talks about marriage being under attack. We see that in his day, and we see that in our day. Now, let's look at verse 32, which talks about marriage under God. Marriage under God. He says in verse 32, but I say to you. I want you to think about that for a second. It helps me understand why people in Jesus' day would be astonished at his teaching, because they say that he taught with authority. That's a pretty bold thing to say about this subject. Listen to what I have to say about marriage. Why? Why should we listen to what Jesus has to say? He's claiming to be God. Who created marriage in the first place? Who invented it? It was God. And therefore, we should listen to what Jesus has to say about the subject of marriage. He says, "But I say to you that whoever divorces his wife for any reason except sexual immorality causes her to commit adultery, and whoever marries a woman who is divorced commits adultery." Jesus uses very strong language. He talks about adultery. And I remember as a kid when I read this the first time, we had to read this when I was in fourth grade. We read through the Sermon on the Mount. I can still remember as a fourth grader having all these questions. Well, what about that? That's weird. And one of the questions I had is, well, if someone just gets divorced, how is that considered adultery? Well, in Jesus' day, again, there were no women's rights like we have today. The culture was much different. And for a woman to be single, either widowed or divorced, that was a very big challenge for her economically. So most women would get remarried as soon as they could, um, really just out of survival. They needed a husband to provide for them. They needed a husband to take care of them. And so they would often get remarried. And that's what Jesus is talking about here. The idea of after the woman is divorced, she gets remarried. And in that sense, in some cases, Jesus says that is considered adultery in God's eyes. Now, before you go jumping to conclusions, I have a lot more to say. So buckle up. Let's skip over to Matthew chapter 19. Because this is not the only time we see this mentioned by Jesus, even in this book. We see these exact same words in Matthew chapter 19. So notice what it says in Matthew 19, beginning in verse 3. It says, "The Pharisees also came to him, testing him, and saying to him, 'Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for just any reason?'" That's an important thing to think about. Their question was, hey, can we get divorced for any reason? A la the school of Hillel. They're asking, is Hillel right? Or is it Shammai who's right? What does Jesus say in verse 4? "And he answered and said, 'Have you not read that he who made them at the beginning made them male and female? And he said, for this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So then, they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let not man separate.'" So they want to quote Moses and they want to quote their rabbis in their day, but what Jesus does is he says, let's go back to the beginning. Let's go back to God, who said what? Of Adam and Eve, he said, they are one. They are one flesh. And therefore, since they are one flesh, Jesus says, if they have become one, don't separate those. What God has brought together, let not man separate. And this idea of one flesh is very important in God's eyes. When we get married, we become one with our spouse. When we're talking about true biblical marriage, a marriage between a man and a woman, a heterosexual marriage, that's what we're considering. This word is the same word that's used of God, the Trinity. God is three in one. In the Hebrew, it's the word echad. Adam and Eve were one. They were welded together. That's one of the words that one of the commentaries used, and I really like that idea of welding. I kind of think about welding sometimes in some of the jobs that I've had over the years. When you weld something together, it's very hard to take it apart. Maybe you could think of the idea of gluing. And sometimes in teaching the teens on this subject, I would take two pieces of paper and take glue and glue them together. And then I'd set that aside and let that dry. And then after it dried, I would take that back out and I would try to rip that apart. And what would happen? Pieces of this paper, whether it's the red sheet of paper, and pieces of this paper, whether it's the purple sheet of paper, would be on here, and it doesn't work. It doesn't rip apart. It doesn't separate. And that's why in many people's lives who've experienced divorce, there has been a lot of pain and a lot of trauma and a lot of difficulty. But that's not where Jesus stops. He goes on. Notice what it says in verse 7. They ask him another question. They said to him, "Why then did Moses command to give a certificate of divorce and to put her away?" See, in their eyes, they thought that Deuteronomy chapter 24 was God commanding, hey, you can go ahead and get divorced. They saw it as a huge loophole that you could drive a Mack truck through. But that's not what those verses were saying. Notice what it says in verse 8. Jesus said to them, "Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, permitted you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so." It wasn't God's original plan. Verse 9, "And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery, and whoever marries her who is divorced commits adultery." And that's the verse that sounds almost exactly like Matthew chapter 5, verse 32. So now we see and understand a little bit more of what Jesus means when he said these, or what he meant when he said these words in the Sermon on the Mount. Now, I want to let you know I read a lot on this subject this week. I probably read more this week on this than I have in a while. There is a lot written about these verses. And if you want, I can give you some resources. If you have questions, let me know. I'll email you some links and give you some resources. This is a subject that I've had to study through before, research through before, but I feel like I've read even more on the subject. And as I've read through the different commentators and the different views, there are three views of divorce in Christianity. And the question is divorce permissible? Does God allow for divorce? So there are three views. There are some who say always, yes, for any reason. Then there is the polar opposite of that, which is never. And then there are some who say sometimes. So let's walk through that. Some would say it's always permissible. Do you think that's what Jesus meant in Matthew chapter 5, verse 32? Yeah, go ahead. You feel like getting divorced? Have at it. I don't think that's what he's saying at all. I think that's actually the polar opposite of what Jesus is saying. And many liberal theologians and liberal pastors, that's where they fall. So no, I don't agree with that at all. That's terrible exegesis. That's terrible interpretation. That's just making the Word of God say whatever you want it to say. Now, the polar opposite of that is never. There are no exceptions, these people would say. There's never a time when God would permit someone or a couple to be divorced. They are one flesh. And one of those who is a proponent of this is John Piper. I highly respect John Piper. If you look in my library, I have probably a dozen books by John Piper. I've met him before. I highly respect him. And he is one of those who thinks that there are no exceptions. One should never get a divorce. And you might say, well, why does Jesus say in verse 32 of Matthew 5, "I say to you, whoever divorces his wife for any reason except sexual immorality"? Why did Jesus say that? It sounds like Jesus has an exception. It sounds like there is an exception clause in these verses. And here is John Piper's reasoning. He goes back to the Christmas story. Most people who study the book of Matthew, they will say Matthew was written to a Jewish audience. And so a Jewish audience would understand this. So he goes back to the Christmas story. In the Christmas story that we all know, Matthew chapter 1, verse 18, "Now the birth of Jesus Christ was as follows. After his mother Mary was betrothed to Joseph, before they came together, she was found with child of the Holy Spirit. Then Joseph, her husband, being a just man, and not wanting to make her a public example, was minded to put her away secretly." So this is called the betrothal view. And it gets into some culture and it gets into some Jewish things. So in the Jewish culture in Jesus' day, when a couple would get engaged, that was called the betrothal period. They would be betrothed to each other. And that was a very uh, formal, a much more formal and much more strong relationship than what we have today when we consider um, engagement. And it involved almost like a covenant that was signed between the husband or the man and the woman. They weren't technically husband and wife yet, but they were betrothed. And in order for that contract to be broken, they would literally have to go through a divorce. They had not slept together yet, they had not consummated the marriage yet, but they were in a very strong contract together, and in order to separate, they would have to be divorced. And so John Piper and those who take this view call this the betrothal view, and they say in our day and age we don't do it that way, and therefore there are no exceptions. They would say. Now there's a lot, and you can read Piper's statement for free on his website if you want to. He goes through a lot of details as to why he takes this view. When he was pastoring at a church in Minneapolis, they actually had a differing view from him. It's kind of interesting how it all played out, but that's just kind of a brief overview of his view. There are others who fall into the camp of never, who have different reasoning. They say that when Jesus says except for sexual immorality, he's referring to unlawful marriages between cousins or between siblings, and therefore, if that happens, those couples can get divorced. But let's talk about the other view. Some pastors and theologians and Christians believe that the exception clause should be read as you read it, or should be understood as you read it. So whereas John Piper is one of the proponents of this, John MacArthur takes this view. Now I want you to understand that it's not just anything, any kind of exception that applies here. It's only, in these people's views, it's only certain biblical exceptions. And the exception that they would talk about is here in verse 32, except sexual immorality. What does that mean? The word sexual immorality is in the Greek the word porneia, and it is a very broad term that talks about any kind of sexual sin. It's referring to homosexual sex, it's referring to adultery, it's referring to premarital sex, it refers to any kind of sexual sin. And in that case, if a spouse commits adultery, they would say that that the innocent party is permitted to have a divorce. Now, those who take this view are, especially MacArthur in his commentary, are very quick to say, Jesus or God's not commanding that you have to get a divorce if an adultery takes place, but He is allowing that. And so I would say to a couple, if that happens, it's not a guarantee that you have to get a divorce. You can work through that. You also need to think about Jesus' other teachings on forgiveness, on reconciliation. So there can be a situation where a couple, if adultery occurs, they can work through that. They can make it work. The other exception that MacArthur and those who take this view refer to is found in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. All right, we got a lot to cover, so let's flip over quick. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, Paul is writing to the Corinthians, and he's writing to them about different questions that they have. And he refers to a situation where there is a marriage between a believer and an unbeliever. Now, it wasn't that the marriage took place after the believer became a believer. It's The marriage was already there, and then one of the spouses became a believer. Okay, that's important to note because Paul is very clear that believers should not marry unbelievers. So it took place after the person got saved. I'm sorry. The marriage was already in place, and then the person got saved. And then what does he say? In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 12, to the rest, I, not the Lord, say, if any brother has a wife who does not believe, and she is willing to live with him, let him not divorce her. And a woman who has a husband who does not believe, if he is willing to live with her, let her not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but now they are holy. But if the unbeliever departs, let him depart. A brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God has called us to peace. So MacArthur and others would look at this, especially in verse 15, and they would say, if there is desertion that takes place in a marriage between a believer and an unbeliever, the unbeliever deserts their believing spouse and says, I don't want to be married to you anymore. You're crazy. You're a Christian now. I'm out. What does Paul say in verse 15? He says, they are no longer under bondage. Okay, so some would say, all right, MacArthur's a liberal when it comes to this. MacArthur is very progressive when it comes to this. MacArthur was a pastor in California, so maybe the Californian culture had an impact on his view. But I want you to understand that this is not just something that crazy Californian people believe. I want to share with you a quote from the Westminster Confession of Faith of 1646. Now, before I put it up here, this is a very common document, very popular document amongst Protestants. In fact, I would venture to say most of you have probably quoted from it. The Westminster Catechism says this: the chief end of man is to glorify God and what? Oh, some of you even quoted it. You know it. Okay, so from that same document, from the Confession of Faith of 1646, it says this: in the case of adultery after marriage, it is lawful for the innocent party to sue out a divorce. Notice the text that they give. Matthew chapter 5, 31. This is a document from the 1600s. Also, in that same document, it says this: nothing but adultery or such willful desertion as can no way be remedied by the church or civil magistrate is cause sufficient of dissolving the bond of marriage. That's a big sentence, but notice the texts that they give. Matthew 19, 1 Corinthians 7. Okay, we just looked at those. So even these men, and these were no slouches, okay? These were men who knew their Bibles. They studied it well. They understood it well. And according to them, there are two exceptions, two situations, biblically speaking, where people are permitted by God to get a divorce. Now, again, those who take this view are very clear when they say not just any kind of adulterous act or just once or anything like that requires you to get a divorce. You can work through things. Forgiveness can take place if the guilty party repents, if they confess, they move on, marriages can last. But there are some situations where, sadly, they can't and they won't. For instance, I had a professor in seminary, very loved by the students. He was a brilliant man. He was a godly man. And his wife, she just left him. She just upped and left him. She moved in with a man, and she had an affair with him, and she decided he was the one for her. What's he going to do? He had a divorce. Okay, so that covers the different views on divorce. Jesus also talks about remarriage. Okay, is it permissible for a divorced person to remarry? Again, there's three views on this. Okay? I know we're going a little longer than normal, but we got to cover a lot of ground here. There's three views on this. Always, never, sometimes. Same kind of categories, same people fall in these categories. Again, a very liberal view. This is something, again, that the liberals in Jesus' day believed. This is not something that anyone who I would respect would hold according to, like the commentaries and so forth. Then you have the never people, that's John Piper again, and then you have the sometimes people, and that's John MacArthur again. Okay? So these people would say that the exception clause in Matthew chapter 5, verse 32 refers not just to the divorce, but the idea of remarriage. That it covers both of those things. And again, that's something that I read from Kevin DeYoung, another one who holds this view. But again, this is not a modern view. It also says in the Westminster Confession of Faith this: in the case of adultery after marriage, it is lawful for the innocent party to sue out a divorce. And then it says, and after the divorce, to marry another as if the offending party were dead. Very strong language. So, why would they say that? Why would they say it's okay? Again, when we go back to this, the two exceptions are the same here as they are here: adultery and desertion. So again, if you go back to 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 15, Paul uses the phrase, they are not under bondage. They're not bound. That's very similar language to what he uses in Romans chapter 7 when he says, when a woman is married to a husband and her husband dies, she's no longer bound. She's free to remarry. Similar language. And so that's where people point when it comes to these exceptions. Now, you might ask, well, where do you fall, Pastor Josh? What do you think? I want you to know it matters more about what does the Bible say. So I'll tell you where I fall on this, but I want you to study the Bible for yourself, to read the commentaries for yourself, to get into it for yourself. I take MacArthur's view. I believe there are some rare exceptions where some are permitted to divorce. What are those exceptions? The ones that we just covered: adultery and desertion by an unbelieving spouse. Now, it's rare. It doesn't happen often, but it does happen. And I believe God gives us permission in those kinds of cases. Again, I would counsel a couple who is going through either one of these things. I would counsel them to try to work it out as best they can. Forgiveness can take place. I've seen it in friends' marriages. I've seen it in marriages in our church in Australia. We had a couple who got a divorce before they got saved. The wife got saved, and then the husband was led to the Lord. And we had sorry, I'm going to get choked up. We had the greatest wedding I've ever been to when that couple got remarried. It was amazing. So I'm not going to say, I definitely don't land here. Okay? This is a no-no. But good people differ on where they land, either here or here. Very knowledgeable, very godly people disagree on this. But I land and I take MacArthur's view. Now let me conclude with three things. Okay? First of all, when it comes to this idea, we should focus on the rule, not the exceptions. If your takeaway from this sermon is, well, there's all these exceptions, then you've missed the point. Okay, what's the point that Jesus is trying to make here in chapter 5, verses 31 through 32? He's trying to say that marriage is a big value in God's kingdom. That God has sanctified marriage and that it is sacred and that we should hold it in great value. Focus on the rule, not the exceptions. Number two, if you are married, you should fight for your marriage. Fight for it. it is important in God's eyes, it should be important in your eyes. When you have an argument with your spouse, don't bring up divorce. I remember I had a coworker, he came into work one day and he was like, I was like, how's it going? He looked down. Oh, it's pretty bad. Well, what happened? Me and the missus got into a fight last night. Well, what happened? She took off her wedding ring, she threw it at me, and she said, I'm done. And then she put it on eventually, and they patched things up. But that's not the way to fight for your marriage. Fight for it in positive ways. Woo your spouse. Love them. Be kind to them. Fight for your marriage. And finally, a last thing that I would say is fools rush in. We've all heard the phrase fools rush in, but it's important to think about the fact that God views marriage as a lifetime commitment. And if it is a lifetime commitment until death do us part, we should not rush into it. We should take our time in making a decision to marry someone. I remember when I worked at Verizon Wireless, the only kind of contract that we had at the time was a 2-year contract. Almost every single customer that I'd have come in signing up for a cell phone, when I'd say, okay, this is the 2-year contract. You're on this for 24 months. You'd be like, oh, man, that's a long time. I don't know if I can sign a contract for 2 years. Wow, really, 2? And they would spend a ton of time hemming and hawing. And I don't know. If people do that for a 2-year contract, don't you think you should do that for a lifetime contract? You should take your time. Date the person that you're interested in. Do your homework. Do your research. Find out what kind of person they really are. That's why I highly recommend premarital counseling before you actually get married. Go through premarital counseling, and your pastor or your counselor will help you walk through these kinds of things. Fools rush in. Take it slow. All right. At the end of the day, we need to look at the upside down value that Jesus brings up in this passage. And that is that marriage is sacred. Marriage is holy. Marriage is important in God's eyes. And it should be in ours too. If you have questions, if you need some resources on this subject, please don't hesitate to email me, talk to me, call me. I'd love to walk through some things with you and share some things with you. Let's close with prayer. Dear God, we thank you for the gift of marriage. We thank you for your Son who was very clear in his word to us about what you think about marriage. So we pray that you would help us to value our marriages like you value them. Help us to fight for them. Help us to do right by our spouses. Protect the marriages of our church from the evil one. Give us strong marriages, we pray. And we pray for those who are considering marriage, those who are single. We ask that you give them wisdom as they seek a spouse of their own. We pray these things in Jesus' name.